Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Wow, that's loud, which is good. Because although you're doing the right thing by chatting with each other, and I love the energy and buzz in the room, we're going to begin our program. So I'll just ask seat if you would. A really warm welcome from me. I'm Raj Kumar. I'm the president and editor-in-chief of Devex. Delighted to be here in Morocco, my first time here in Marrakech, and at the World Bank and IMF annual meetings, I guess the first in 50 years on the African continent. Pretty amazing when you think about what the work of those two institutions really are, that we're here, important symbolically. And I think for one of the hottest tickets here in Marrakech for this event. So thank you for coming, all of you, and for all of you who are joining us online on various platforms. We've got a big global audience who are following these discussions. And these are some of the most important discussions that will happen this week here in Morocco. You can spend your life going from ballroom to ballroom if you work in global development. Why is this so important? I think it's so important because we're getting away from just the big technical questions around debt and around climate and development, and we're getting into sort of the meat of the issue. And it's one of the reasons why all eyes are on the World Bank and IMF this year at these meetings. I think this is the most hotly anticipated annual meetings I've ever seen. It's partly because there's a new president of the institution, Najib Banga, and everyone wants to know what's he going to do, what's the reform, what is he going to announce this week. But it's partly because of the situation the world is in, and that the world increasingly is looking to these institutions as the potential saviors. And we're here to ask whether or not they can be, and ask what they might need to do differently to fill that critical role. So I think it's an important discussion we're going to have today, and we're having it with the support of the Open Society Foundation. So I want to really thank them for partnering with us at Devex to make this event possible and to bring it to all of you in the room and around the world. So thank you, OSF. To get us started, we in fact have the president of the Open Society Foundations with us, and we're going to have a conversation here on stage and then move into a panel conversation. So I want to invite my friend Mark Malik Brown to join me. Okay, well, Mark, there are, as usual, many things we could talk about, and I have the great pleasure to be on stages like this with you fairly often. And given your history as a senior leader at the UN, and you were at the World Bank too some years ago, in government in the UK, et cetera, there's always a range of things I can ask you. But I've got to start today, in part because I don't think you have been asked this yet, or at least not publicly. I've got to start with the situation in Israel and Gaza. We are obviously here to talk about something else in the conversation, but this is something I think the world and people associated with this, these issues need to hear from you on. So maybe just your high-level take to start.
Well, I mean, Open Society works.
Let me just fix your mic. I think it's
There you go. Open Society works both in Israel and in Palestine. And so for all of us, whether we're staff in those two programs or elsewhere in the world, this has been a devastating, tragic week. You know, obviously it began with the Hamas attack on so many innocent children, young people at a disco, civilians in kibbutzes and elsewhere. You know, and it was tragic beyond words. But of course, already we're forced to look beyond that initial killing to the danger of the reprisals similarly failing utterly to meet the protection of civilian human rights. There simply isn't in humanitarian law space for the collective punishment of the civilians in Gaza through the cutting off of water, electricity, through indiscriminate, as I fear will happen, attacks on them and their communities. So, you know, in a way, I hope those in Israel are giving clear thought to the fact, don't give Hamas an easy win by falling into exactly the trap they've laid for you, which is, you know, a reciprocal response which repeats too many of the human rights abuses of the original attack.
It sounds like you're seeing the way this could play out in a potentially devastating way from a humanitarian standpoint. Take us through your thinking there. You've been involved in attempting to make peace and dealing with conflicts like this, even in the region, throughout your career, including at the UN. How do you see this maybe playing out more broadly? Where does it go from here?
Well, there are lots of echoes, and it's always difficult to know which are the right historical precedents and which are misleading ones. And many Israelis in the hours immediately after the original attack made references to this is our 9/11. And I'm sure, obviously, for this number of lives lost in Israel, that is the right parallel. It is as shocking to them as 9/11 was to those of us living in America or New York at the time. But, potentially there is a further comparison to 9/11. And I say potentially because at this stage it's much too soon to know. But you can quite well see that the same way that 9/11 reshaped geopolitics and reshaped the way much of the world looked at foreign policy, the same may happen here. From a much more nuanced, rights-based approach to foreign policy that existed in Europe and the US immediately before 9/11, we went very quickly to the language of a war on terror and a two-dimensionality to the West's foreign policy, which has taken years to dig out from, and which would be a tragedy if the consequence of this was to throw us back into that. And, having been at the UN and been Deputy Secretary General at the time of 2005 in southern Lebanon, I know just how dangerous this is when these attacks are responded to by an intervention. This is really tough stuff, and Netanyahu knows that from his own experience. It is, you are really getting into a quagmire when you go in with land troops, and the Israelis didn't thank us at the time, but they were very grateful for a UN blue line between them and Hezbollah. And, I think what everybody has to reflect on, and this is, a difficult point to make at a moment when feelings are as aggravated as they currently and rightly and presently are, is, you may be able to destroy Hamas militarily, but you cannot destroy Palestine or the Palestinians militarily. And if I have one lesson from a career spent in development, diplomacy, and human rights, where all three disciplines take you to a shared understanding, is people who are being marginalized, who are being pushed out of the political mainstream, who are being denied political voice, have an extraordinary way of disruptively making that voice heard in ways which throws the whole world off kilter. And that had a lot to do with the background to 9/11. And, we really need to show statesmanship in the response to this to make sure that we don't, even in their moment of, I suspect, likely military extinction, give Hamas a victory which they were denied in their period of running Gaza.
It's an important message, and as you know, the Israeli government now has an emergency coalition government, and it seems clear that the direction of travel is what you're worried about. So hearing this message from you, that there maybe is an alternative, there should be a pause and a think, is important.
Yeah, I think for now the alternative is pause. It's probably too soon to think. Tempers are too aroused. The tragedy's still too much in mind. But don't do things now that force you into a direction which doesn't allow you to come back to a path of reconciliation and ultimately a political solution to the problem of the rights of the Palestinians.
Your point about people sometimes having a way of being disruptive, people who are marginalized, who are left behind, I think is relevant to the topic of our broader discussion today. Because we're here to talk about countries in the MENA region that are low income, that are middle income, that have to import fuel, that face the effects of inflation in food especially, but in other areas too. And it's easy at the World Bank and the IMF annual meetings to have a very technical conversation and to sort of say, well, how do we balance the budgets? These are countries with a lot of debt. This should be pretty straightforward. We should increase some tax here. We should cut some public spending there. And you, in fact, hear some discussions along those lines just down the road here at these annual meetings. We're here at this conversation to say, well, what's sort of missing in that discussion? What is this political or political economy lens? How do you see it?
Well, look, I mean, this is a great region to be for this conversation, precisely because of the tragedies of the region. 5 million people having lost their jobs since COVID, a huge demographic kind of bulge of younger people who can't get decent jobs and onto a proper job ladder, and levels of public debt running in the high 80%, 90% of GDP for many of these economies. So, quite clearly, the development approach isn't working for them. And, it's partly because these institutions, sort of struggle with the middle income group versus low incomes, and there's different instruments for different groups, and there's a bit of a mismatch around, frankly, this region doesn't in many cases have the level of governance that you would anticipate to go with middle income countries. There's still too much corruption, too much unaccountability in too many of the economies to score highly on how development assistance is allocated. But I think there's a bigger issue, which even when you take the World Bank and IMF to Africa, impedes you, which is, and I used to say this as someone who was a vice president at the World Bank, but then went on to leadership in the UN, is the problem with these institutions is ultimately they silo the discussions about resources, because they are financing institutions. They're not ultimately policy institutions. I mean, they do policy at the national level. They're all too good at austerity at the national level. But what they don't do is the big global questions. So, today, the IRA out of the US and CBAM, its equivalent out of Europe, are going to take away from developing countries in a region like this much more lost GDP than is going to be made up for, even under the most optimistic assessments of enhanced inflows from the outcome of meetings like Marrakech.
These are the climate initiatives that the Europeans and the Americans have put together, which essentially subsidizes the climate work in their locations.
It's a 10 times, in terms of impact, probably 10 times the impact of new financial flows is these subsidies, which are seeing a roar of capital being reallocated from not just developing countries, well, pretty much everywhere, to new green industrial jobs in the US and their counterparts in Europe. And when you combine that with really quite high interest rates now across much of the developing world, you're going to see massive, distortion of investment back into the US and into Europe. And, in the UN, I always had this ambition. These were the happier days of the UN, where there was some kind of global consensus on which the organization could build. What we're missing is an Economic Security Council. We had hopes the G20 might be that. There needed to be somewhere where these big questions of policy imbalances could be addressed, because they don't fit neatly just into the discussions around the policies and fundings of particular institutions like the fund and the bank. So, we have a dysfunctional political security council, and we've never had an economic security council. So more than ever, we are, when you look at these fundamentals of the polycrisis, plus a Russia-Ukraine war, plus a really high-risk Middle East now, we are an unhinged world, as the UN Secretary General chose to call it, without decent governance.
I mean, for all of those reasons, I think the World Bank and the IMF are being looked to in a way they haven't been before, because the world says, well, these are institutions that already exist, they're functional, they're funded, let's just do more with them. Ajay Banga, as we've reported today, has said, look, we're going to do better first, we're going to improve the World Bank, then we'll think about getting bigger. Do you agree with that formulation, or are you saying, look, this is the wrong approach, it needs to get bigger right now?
Well, look, I think there's 2 points. I mean, first, we're huge supporters of along with other foundations, some in the room, Rockefeller, others, SIF, I think maybe here too, and Gates. You know, we're all working really hard behind many grantee partners to push these institutions to grow their resources, to sort of sweat their capital better, to go back to capitals to raise more. So, you know, even if it is an incremental reform, it's worth it in its own right, because more money dispersed quicker is lives saved. And, you know, the trouble is, you know, that sounds like a message, a humanitarian message, but it's become a development message. Lives are hanging on this. But, and this I think is the bigger point, Raj, I mean, you know, I think Ajay Banga is having to respond to his to the demands coming out of both White House Washington, but as a response of what's playing out on Capitol Hill Washington, which is don't ask for a capital increase now. It'll get thrown back at you at the time that they can't even fund the US government, and there's such a row about the funding of the Ukraine war, etc. But, you know, the rest of us are not impeded by that. The rest of us should say, yeah, bigger as soon as you can be, because the needs are out there. We cannot, you know, we cannot cut the cloth of the global development response to the polycrisis to the prejudices of a couple of Midwestern Republican senators.
I mean, it's a great point, and it's always interesting to see you, with all the official hats that you've worn over the years, here as a CSO representative. I see on your badge at the annual meetings. Here to be an activist and to speak truth to power, which is refreshing. I guess one final thought for you as we wrap up, given that you know, you've seen both sides of this. You've seen the pressures of being in political leadership, and now on the other side, the opportunities when you've got a war chest, as you do at OSF, and you've got a voice. Many people, especially people in civil society, are saying, look, this is this crisis moment. Use the term polycrisis. They're saying, you know, when Bretton Woods was established, it was a similar crisis moment, and we need to rethink the international architecture. Do you feel we're at that moment? Do you think that the politics are there for us to truly rewrite the way these institutions work, especially and including when we think about the MENA region and what may be coming forward if things aren't done differently?
I think we're at a moment of complete both dysfunction and demand at the same time. The need for regional and global solutions to problems has rarely, if ever, been more pressing. And yet the geopolitics are so divided that the current multilateral system cannot deliver on that demand. And so I think what you're seeing is a new informal multilateralism, or, you know, in many cases a regionalism with aspirations to be multilateral developing instead. So you're seeing a lot more energy around, for example, countries lining up to join the BRICS, or the G20 and Africa's welcome new membership through the AU of the G20. So you're seeing, and I think similarly, you know, a rebirth almost of NATO around the tragedy of the Ukraine conflict. So you're seeing a lot of different institutions, either single issue institutions or regional institutions, you know, coming back, recovering, or being born with a lot of energy in them, because this need to collaborate around issues of security, AI, climate, poverty, migration is so demanding and in need. But you've got a geopolitics which won't deliver it. So you're not going to have a Bretton Woods moment or a San Francisco moment. World statesmen are not going to somberly gather and design a new world order. It's going to come through campaigners and activists and coalitions of the willing, combining to address particular problems they care about, and hoping that over time they'll find a way of taking that issue more global and more universal.
Well, hence the importance, I think, of the discussion that we're about to have. What might seem like a technical issue, but is a really critical issue for the future of the region and the world. So please join me in thanking Mark Malloch Brown. So So we're going to get into our conversation. I want to ask our panelists for this discussion to just go ahead and join me on stage, and I'll introduce you in just a moment. Please join me here. And I want to mention for those of you who are following this that the conversation will be in English, but you can use channel 1 for Arabic, channel 5 for French, or channel 9 for English when we get to Q&A if we have questions in other languages. Welcome. So let me just introduce our panelists here. And I think we've got a couple more microphones coming for you. We have Ishaq Diwan, who is the research director for the Finance for Development Lab at the Paris School of Economics. Thanks for being here, Ishaq. Timothy Caldas is the deputy director for the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy.
Yes.
Thanks for being here as well, Timothy.
Pleasure, thanks.
And Alexa Tiemann is the associate director and the MENA lead economist at the EBRD. Hi, Alexa. So the three of you have a lot of expertise on this region, and we want to dive into a conversation that's happening just down the road, where people at the IMF, people at the World Bank are looking at countries in North Africa, across MENA, especially thinking of the countries that are lower income, middle income, that have to import a lot of fuel, import food, that are squeezed between rising inflation and increased public debt. And they're saying, look, we know the formula for how to solve this. The formula is austerity. This is a simple math problem. Maybe we increase taxes, maybe we cut spending. We just have to get these economies to be more fit. And the conversation we want to bring to the table today is, well, maybe that's the wrong way to look at it. Maybe there's a different perspective. And we should think about this in a slightly different way, as Mark Malik Brown kind of laid out for us. So, Ishaq, I just want to start with you. When you think about the region and the challenges that it's facing, how do you see it at a high level?
Well, when I think about Lebanon, Egypt, Tunisia, I see leaders that are much more interested in politics than in economics. And they're not doing the right thing on the economic side. This is why we had, in 2011, riots and Arab Spring and a revolution. And since then, nothing was fixed. Basically, they spent a bit more, accumulated debt, got IMF agreement to borrow more, and didn't deal at all with the structural issues. They're very myopic, defensive regimes. And when the international organization pushed them to take commitments in order to bail them out, to support them, you cannot force a regime that doesn't want to reform. So, the model that we got into in the 90s, after the state-led model went bankrupt, is not sustainable. It's one of crony capitalism controlled by the state, a small private sector, large informal sector, subsidies through geopolitical games, and we need to move, in order for the situation to be sustainable socially, into a productive system. And that takes political leadership, and constantly bailing out these regimes doesn't get us there.
Yeah, Timothy, this is not the first time we've been here. This is not the first conversation around bailouts or debt reduction. Why do we keep coming back to the same situation for these countries?
I mean, I think there's a number of issues on the point of austerity. I mean, the IMF actually doesn't say austerity anymore. They say, if you actually look at their literature, they've concluded that austerity is counterproductive. They've concluded that austerity worsens debt ratios, deepens inequality, which they now recognize is macro-critical and harms their objectives. They say that progressive taxation is the way forward. They say that investment in healthcare and education is actually also vital for growth and for sustainability. And yet their programs don't reflect that, right? There's a failure to implement what their literature has concluded is necessary. And when you talk to them about it, they say, well, the government came to us with these regressive proposals, and we actually recommended more progressive structures, but they're a sovereign government, they made this decision. And I think there's a disingenuousness to that, and there's a bit of a laziness to that, in the sense that they do say no, right? I mean, it's not like the IMF accepts whatever the government brings to them. They are very adamant, for example, in the last number of years about the removal of energy subsidies. This is a major focus of theirs. But they could be just as adamant that regressive taxation, that VAT, which we know has a negative impact on the population, has a negative impact on the economy, weakens domestic demand, weakens the private sector and the incentive to invest. They could also insist that, no, you can't have a revenue structure that's dependent on VAT, that you have to actually invest in the capacity of the state to collect taxes progressively, that you have to build this out. But they refuse to do so. And I think they fail to appreciate that the political economy of these countries is such that the people that they're negotiating with have an incentive to protect the elites at the expense of their own populations.
I want to get back in a minute to why you think the institutions like the IMF aren't taking that knowledge and doing something about it. But I just want to stay on kind of the high level of what's going on in the region first and bring you into the discussion, Alexa, because obviously, you know, when Russia invaded Ukraine and we saw the impact on food prices, most people around the world who study this stuff said, look at MENA. Be careful in MENA. I mean, that's where you're going to see bread prices rise in Cairo, and what is it going to mean for political stability, right? So people were focused on this region. Of course, since then, some things maybe have improved a bit, but the broader dynamic is the same. Interest rates are much higher. They've gone up substantially. Food prices are still very elevated, as are other prices. How do you see the squeeze that the region is in, and do you think it's kind of headed in an unsustainable direction at this point?
Well, I think these countries face enormous challenges at this time. Some, let's be honest, by their own making, some by unfortunate circumstances. First, the pandemic that led a lot of these countries to take on extra debt that at the time the funding was needed to manage the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic, and to put in, just to flag, the IMF was, I think, often the first institution to disburse to these countries, quickest off the bat in providing help. So that's, I think, should not be neglected. However, with the extra debt burden that they had, plus the structural challenges that they had before, think, for example, the wage bill in Tunisia, which eats a significant part of government revenues. And that, coupled with the inflation, the war on Ukraine, the global inflation that has triggered, that has just exacerbated the existing problems, plus the pandemic debt, plus the debt dynamics before. So I think it's a lot of factors coming together and squeezing these countries, which is indeed a challenge that's, I think, that is very difficult to manage. I mean, one way of this, to address this is, of course, look at the debt and the debt sustainability. But another thing, more in keeping with what we've been discussing, look at structural policies, and also, if you mention inflation for food prices, look at food security. And I think there are a lot of things institutions can do. Subsidies and price controls are never the most efficient way to alleviate pressure on households. As you said, that is reforming towards targeted social transfers for the vulnerable households, and scrapping blanket subsidies would be a much more efficient way to spend government money while making it easier for those households who most need it. And also, let's not forget, steer demand in the right direction. For example, if you think about fuels, as long as fuel is inordinately cheap, it encourages more consumption that is economically efficient. And beyond that, there are other ways where IFIs could support domestic value chains and food production, ensure sustainable access, sustainable sourcing of food inputs to help households manage the burden that we currently see.
But you can see how a fragile political state, how a leader running a country trying to manage multiple constituencies might appreciate subsidies, might appreciate the ability to kind of mandate and control the economy, even if it's highly inefficient, and be concerned about reforming that. I mean, to Isaac's earlier point, you said they're not interested in economy, they're more interested in politics. Maybe another way to translate that is they're interested in short-term politics, because in the long run, the economy matters politically too. But they're looking for, how do I survive tomorrow or next week and not necessarily next year? Is there some way to change that dynamic, to make the long term an immediate opportunity for these economies? I think, Timothy, you might have wanted to jump in on this point or something similar, or Isaac, either of you.
I wanted to clarify something, but you can go for
I mean, I think at least for these three countries and possibly for Jordan soon, we are at that time. I mean, the choices are very stark. The markets have closed on them. They have debt due that's coming.
And they can't borrow more.
And they can't borrow to refinance it. So they'll have to cut very deep into, and subsidies are not really the big issues anymore. They've been cutting subsidies for years. It's bigger than that. Its interest payments are 35 to 50% of the budget, and now they have to repay the maturities out of the budget. So they really have two choices. Either they double down on repression and really tighten their belt enormously in the economy. They won't be growing because you know, all the capitalists and the business people are out. Investment to GDP is down to, the private investment is down to 5% of GDP in Egypt. Maybe 8% in Tunisia and nothing in Lebanon. I mean, these economies are going down the drain. So,
and you can't blame the private investors in a sense,
course
right?
not.
If this is the dynamic, why invest there?
So there are two choices. Either you go that way, and it's a lot of repression, and you stay, you know, you double down on police and all that, and it's a poverty trap in which you are, or you politically decide that you're going to lead reforms to grow the economy and to grow over your problems. And frankly, the arithmetic is really for the second, because we're not in the 90s anymore. The private sector is bigger, it can grow. You know, there's nearshoring in Europe. Lots of investments are going into Morocco. They could go into Tunisia and Egypt as well. Digitalization, the region hasn't taken advantage of that. We need to focus on adaptation to reduce the problem with global warming. We can, you know, produce new green energy to export to Europe, to produce green products to export to Europe. There are lots of opportunities right now. So the arithmetic should be to go the right way, not down the rat hole of more repression. And we are at that moment.
But it seems like the only way you could make that calculation work is if you're working with the international community. I'm thinking about the opportunity for some kind of debt deal or debt reduction, right, for these countries that can't simply borrow more. And if you have a program with the backing of the IMF that is thinking in these terms, right? So Timothy, what do you talked about the IMF sort of gets it intellectually, but they're not doing it in these countries. What's the missing piece here to get those institutions to do it?
I mean, I think just to also note on the subsidy thing, the World Bank has actually concluded that you need universal social protection. Targeted has failed miserably. It's missed a lot of people. And with the capacity of the state, it's just not there. It's not working. So I just want to clarify that. But in terms of the challenges, I think part of the issue also is that these states don't have credibility. To Assad's point, there isn't any indication that there is actually a commitment to reform. And I think that as much as I have a lot of criticisms of the fund that have been, you know, published and discussed, I think I would also add that the governments themselves, and I'm thinking particularly about Egypt right now, when they get opportunities, they also blow them, right? So, I mean, Egypt got two IMF programs that admittedly were poorly designed, but they catalyzed an enormous amount of access to credit that was very poorly supervised. And the result was in the accumulation of an additional $100 billion in external debt. And the situation that we have before us right now is that this has eaten up any of the runway that they could pursue going forward. So right now, they need breathing room in order to be able to get to try to move towards growth. And I think that if they indicated a seriousness about reform, and that means political economic reform, it means actually reining in the regime's leveraging of the state to enrich and empower itself as it has through all these vanity projects in which it has basically used the state as a vehicle for empowering the regime. You really have to disaggregate the two. The regime being the constellation of powers that have captured the state. So in Egypt it would be the military, general intelligence services, president, and state security. When you disaggregate those two things and you realize there's a lack of convergence in their interests, you better understand what we're actually observing in terms of the political economy of Egypt. And unfortunately for now, they insist on continuing to be predatory. So I think that there needs to, in the case of Egypt, I worry that the government doesn't get it. And between fearing dismantling its patronage network that the regime is built on, and fearing being completely dependent on the Gulf, which is the basis of the additional financing in their current IMF deal, we have a total stagnation and a total impasse in terms of trying to get the reforms through. And the sad thing is that the population is going to suffer further.
Sure. And you would think that the IMF, in looking to do a new deal with Egypt, would think about exactly those political economy issues, and not that they're easy to solve, but try to solve for them in a new deal.
And to their credit, in the newest deal, they finally started touching on those things. But the trouble also for the IMF is that they lack expertise in political economy. They don't have country experts. They don't have sociologists or historians. They're only economists. They're generalists. And you can't learn on the job with a country of 100 million people. And it shouldn't take 3 programs to finally mention the Egyptian military. Anyone who's an expert on Egypt could have told you that this is a fundamental issue from 40, 50 years ago.
Alexa, I want to bring you back in the discussion, hear anything you want to respond to on this, but I especially want to hear this issue of targeted subsidies versus universal ones, because I think it's a live debate inside the World Bank and the IMF. You know, from an economist standpoint, certainly targeting is much more efficient. You reach the people who actually need it, and especially when you're talking about countries that have really tight fiscal constraints, every bit of money counts. But you're hearing, another view which says, look, the targeting doesn't really work in practice. It might work in theory, but it doesn't really work in practice because the state capacity is low. How do you see this from your standpoint?
I really like your metaphor of having eaten up the runway, and I'd like to counter with the thought that maybe the plane is heavier than anybody thought, than the governments thought, but also than the institutions thought. And that is part of really the reason why the runway ran out. It's just a lot harder to do these things. And that is certainly true, I think, for setting up efficient, targeted social welfare systems that are complete registries. I mean, just think of in a country on the scale of Egypt, more than 100 million, capturing everybody, accounting for them, identifying them uniquely, putting them into a registry, making sure that the digital infrastructure is there to transfer money, vouchers, whatever. I mean, that is an enormous task. I think it's commendable that the World Bank and the IMF, for example, have made big pushes in this direction during the pandemic. But again, this plane is at least heavy to get off the ground. And I have heard from governments in the region, we are still working at it. We do want to move towards subsidy reform, but we need to be certain that we have a complete registry before we start cutting back on one and upping the other. And I think we are moving in the right direction. We are probably moving too slowly, definitely more slowly than anybody would wish for on any of the topics that you've mentioned, but I do see progress, and I also see, you mentioned Egypt. I think there is a very strong there is definitely an understanding in the government that the private sector has to become the engine of growth, and that room has to be created, and there have been steps in the right direction. The economic competition, the Egyptian Competition Authority has been strengthened. They've got a new strategy. Competitive neutrality is actually a topic that is being discussed. There has been a state ownership policy to give investors some clarity on how does the state intend to play their role with all the enterprises that you've mentioned, military-owned, otherwise state-owned. So yes, maybe not fast enough, but I think the progress is there, and the best we can do is continue to work on that alongside the governments and do as good as we can do.
Do you recognize some of this progress, Timothy?
I'm afraid not, no. Look, I think the unfortunate reality is that while rhetorically the Egyptian government absolutely has said that, the Prime Minister said we want to invert the investment balance, so going from 1/3 of investment in the economy coming from the private sector to 2/3. We haven't actually seen any actual material progress on that front. Now, there is a state ownership policy that leaves out many of the industries that the military participates in. It just doesn't mention them out at all, such as tourism. The military just bought out a beautiful resort on the Red Sea, by the way, but that was after they signed the IMF deal that insisted that they were going to be reining in these public sector firms, including the military companies. And this is a point that the IMF cares about. Now, finally, they also gave an enormous amount of state land to the military to develop for economic purposes along the new roads that the military was hired to build for free while the state is under financial distress. They also were given control of the Giza Zoo recently, again, after signing the IMF deal. So no, I don't think there's a sincere commitment to this transition. There is a rhetorical commitment to it because this is how you bring in financing. But in reality, they've run circles around a lot of these IFIs. And unfortunately, that includes the EBRD. And I think that it's important for us to recognize this is where the political economy lens is really important. Because if you don't really understand that context, if you don't really understand the political history of these institutions, then it's very easy for them to play you. And I wrote an article about this back in February, and a Lebanese central bank official called me saying, we're seeing the same thing here. And it's just an unfortunate reality. And I do think that one other thing I'll touch on, I know we're tight on time, but one of the things that we need to look at when we look at the capacity issue and the social protection issue, your earlier point, or your earlier question, there's an incongruence in priorities, right? So when IFIs talk about it in the literature, they're pretty clear about the importance of these things. But when we look at the prioritization in their implementation and the program design, we don't see that. So for example, they said, remove energy subsidies and replace them, and take the savings and devote a portion of it to social protection. In the case of Egypt, according to the World Bank, all of the savings from removing the energy subsidies went to reducing the deficit and paying off interest. And the interest
So it didn't go to social protection?
Not a single increase in social protection. That's according to the World Bank. So, but what we have is a situation where, when it comes to taxation, the IFIs are very realistic. That is the easiest way to go. There isn't capacity for targeted progressive taxation, so let's do that to get the revenue in place. When it comes to social protection, they want this idealistic, magical state that can perfectly identify people in the informal sector who are heavily impoverished and outside of the view of the state, to target them and get cash in their hands. And the reality is it doesn't work. And they didn't even specify what level of coverage was supposed to be there until this newest deal, after we insisted on it for years. The previous deals didn't mention anything, and we had 15 million Egyptians receiving cash assistance, while the poverty rate was over 30% at the time. So over 30 million Egyptians were living in poverty, meaning that if you had perfect targeting, and you absolutely did not, but let's say you did, more than half of Egyptians living in poverty received no cash assistance for 7 years of inflation.
Right, and you would think when it's, although the idea of identifying everyone, as Alex says, is really tough, that in that interim period, the people most likely to be left out are probably the most impoverished, the most marginalized. So I just want to let everybody in the room know, and those who are following online, we're going to go to questions in about 10 minutes. So I want you to start thinking of questions, and we're already getting a good debate going on stage. So be ready to probe us with some provocative questions. Isaac, I know you want to jump into the conversation. Go ahead.
I mean, just to open it up a little bit. So I think we all agree that the main driver of the lack of progress is political. But the politics is not rich against poor and subsidies and safety net. That's not where the action is. Maybe that's where the IMF is focusing, because it's where it can focus. But if you take the three countries we're talking about, Tunisia, you know, the union is very strong. You know, we have weak governments, veto players play a big role. So the union has increased wages from whatever 6-7% of GDP to 15% of GDP, and there is much less discipline. So you know, tax collection is very low. There is a lot of corruption, and this gave rise to a populist who's scaring the private sector now. So it's a very different, you know, political economy from Lebanon, which went bust because we had weak power-sharing government and you know, banks that made a fortune and are refusing to take losses right now. From Egypt, where it's the military economy that you know, is scaring the private sector out, away, and the like. So you know, you put the IMF and all of that. They're not ignorant, but they cannot lead a political dialogue. They are pushed to make a deal with Egypt. So you know, we end up with a weird deal. What is $3 billion over 4 years when there is a $20 billion gap a year? You know, they clearly don't want to get into a new Argentina. They're pushed politically there. That's the problem. So they focus on, you know, sell a few firms. Now, of course, it's smart, actually, because if Sisi manages to sell a few military firms, then, you know, he has to have this fight with the military, and we'll see what he can deliver. But what is missing is a political dialogue with other actors. You cannot expect the IMF and the World Bank to sort out, you know, political issues, which are not terribly complicated, by the way. I mean, it's not like one Arab nationalism or what have you. There are different situations. What is preventing what's preventing a new political equilibrium from arising is actually this constant bailing out of regimes in the region that are unstable for fear of getting refugees or, you know, whatever, geopolitical story. So I fail much more the political dialogue than the IMF.
But then again, we don't want to have to wait to get to real crisis, do we, before we reform? Is that what you're saying, that we have to wait until, you know, kind of be a little bit tougher and let these countries fall into a severe debt crisis?
I want to see the EU getting more involved. I want to see US diplomacy getting more involved, because that's where you'll find solutions together, in parallel with the financial support. But financial support alone, with disinterest by, the EU only caring about making a deal to prevent refugees from crossing, and the US being uninterested in the region besides, geopolitical. If we had a good crisis, as in Turkey with new elections after 2000s, it will renew the system. We would be able to take advantage of all the potential in the region. By the way, the nice story coming out of Saudi Arabia is the potential that exists there, right? I mean, for once, we have a leader, we may like him or not, but interested in economics, creating incentives for people to work hard. And here, women labor force participation jumps from 20 to 33%. While we thought, a Salafi country, no way women can work. The potential was there. In Egypt and Tunisia, the saving rate is between 5 and 10% of GDP. Labor force participation has fallen to close to 45% of GDP. People are not mobilized because there are no economic opportunities. It's not an era where if you work hard, you get a better income.
Alexa, you've heard already this idea that there's a bit of a debate between the two of you on where the progress really is, just in Egypt as one example. But Isaac earlier in the conversation said, we're kind of missing the opportunity. There is a new equilibrium out there, and a big element of it is the green transition, that you can invest in the nearshoring for Europe in green products and green energy, and this region is poised in many ways. You've got a big youth unemployment problem, and you can target this industry. Are you seeing that as well as a big opportunity, or do you think it's talk on the part of maybe governments that want to see the IFIs get engaged but aren't really willing to make deep reforms?
Thank you for bringing that up, because I was wondering how I can get onto the topic of the green economy transition. Partly because I think a lot of what is going well or better than in the past in development cooperation among the IFIs and with our partner countries, I think goes comparatively better in the green space. And I want to take up one point again that you said early on. These are sovereign countries, and IFIs have only so much leverage. For us at EBRD, providing loans to enterprises primarily, and occasionally engage with government on policy reforms on the sidelines, or negotiating, trying to push for better circumstances for enterprises, that is our way of engaging, and it is the way that gives us leverage. But the reforms have to come from the government. Back to the green space, two things where I think as IFIs we can genuinely do better. One way I think is cooperating better with each other, avoiding less overlap and speaking more with one voice and pushing for the same things and agreeing on which are the important things. And I think that is easier in the green space, partly because it is a smaller and more circumscribed group of people who liaise more and better on a one-on-one basis. There's something that I feel cooperation goes better. The second thing is, we have a much clearer, we even have a concept of the just transition, where we acknowledge that change brings winners and losers, and we have to support the losers as change happens. The just transition, trying to think about the workers in sectors that will end up being stranded assets, that will go out of the fossil fuel sectors, that will eventually, probably, hopefully disappear. And how can we support them, retrain, reskill, reuse assets, things, and adjust in advance? We don't have that for a lot of other changes, or not as explicitly. We don't have the same consensus when it comes to structural reforms for state-owned enterprises. Who is taking care of the workers that the inflated wage bill, who's taking care of the workers that will potentially have to be laid off in order to constrain the wage bill? Who is, put positively, we should ask ourselves more frequently, what is the global distributional impact, and how can we better support interests across the whole spectrum and make reforms sustainable? And that, I think, would really help to emphasize the elements that you've also been mentioning: structural reform, growth, inclusive, sustainable policies that create a counterbalance.
Yeah, it's great to hear that there is an opportunity when it comes to the green economy, the evolving transition, and that maybe that can be the laboratory of reform that can lead to some broader reform. So we're going to get into that. And I want to welcome people who are in the audience to ask questions. We'll take 3 at a time if we can, if we've got enough. We've got 2 here in the front, and then 1 all the way in the back. And we'll have a microphone come around to you. And just if you would stand, if you can, and say your name. Actually, Richard, all the way in the back there, I think, is the second one. But we'll start here in the front. Just if you could stand, just say your name and organization. We'd appreciate it. And try to ask a question that's relatively brief. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Karen Young. I'm a senior research scholar at Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy and also at the Middle East Institute. My question is on monetary policy. I'm very curious what the 3 of you think. We are headed towards, particularly in the Egyptian case, a scenario in which we will see either a very steep devaluation or perhaps pursuing a restricted monetary policy, a currency basket, or dollarization. I think Egypt will be similar to what we'll see in many other scenarios, countries under pressure with one valve. So do you think that is a good constraint, enforcing more discipline, perhaps in the fiscal space as well? Or do you see that as a negative? I'm hoping there's some disagreement among you.
I love that, yes. We'll see if we can get some. And we can just bring the mic behind you for 1 more.
Hi, I'm Amy Egdawi. I'm from Arab Watch Coalition, and it's not a question, it's something about the green economy and the World Bank plan to do more and quicker. Like the World Bank has now its own evolution roadmap, and it's like the speed and scale, and their theory is this will lead to impact, but we are afraid, and it's not only me, but group of civil society organizations who are working on this really heavily, we are afraid that will lead also to more harms. We have here, a few hours away from Marrakech, we have Ouarzazate, the Noor power plant, and it's uploaded everywhere as a very good green energy, but the community there is suffering, really, and they cannot submit a complaint because the due diligence wasn't done right. So we are afraid with the speed, we welcome investing more, but we are afraid that the speed means the due diligence that is with the current portfolio is really weak. What will happen with more investment, more speed? What will happen? And the accountability system in the World Bank, IFC, the World Bank, is not working. It doesn't provide remedy for people who are left behind.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. We'll address that too. We'll take 1 more in the back. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my name is Nabil Abdo. I will speak a bit with a frustrated voice, so apologies in advance. So, I mean, the title of the session is Austerity in MENA, right? Only Tim mentioned austerity once. So I think that has been really a big lack in terms of the conversation. So I would be happy to hear what austerity has been like for the region, what kind of impact it has been, and what is the role of the IFIs. And I think there is a problem often when we discuss the region and the role of the IMF and international institutions like the EBRD and others, especially in terms of European institutions who care more about countries acting like border control rather than working for their people. But in a sense that we feel that it's like as if the IMF has entered the region like 3 years ago, just before COVID, and then they saved us. And the problem is that we're talking about a region that has, it's like 12 years since the revolutions. We had Tunisia, we had Egypt, Bahrain, we had in Jordan, etc., all of that. And the problem is that also those countries who had the revolutions, especially Egypt and Tunisia, were like praised by all international institutions, such as the IMF, for their like great policies and good governance. When the revolutions happened, oh no, we missed something. And then after that, when the revolutions happened, we had the Deauville partnership with the G8, IMF, World Bank, and GCC. And then apparently the solution for the region were also more IMF programs. And the message was clear for us in the region that you can do a democratic transition, you can go vote in the ballots, but never touch the economic policies. We had calls for social justice, etc. All what we got was austerity and more inequality. And the problem, I'm going to finish here. Yep. Sorry for for taking such a long time. But the problem is also we tend to view economics. Yes, the problem that politicians, yeah, they don't care much about economics, but also economists, they don't seem to care much about social relations, about workers' rights, about all of this, and things seem to them in terms of numbers. Subsidies, public sector are part of a social contract, and it's not just something we can scrap and just say, let's replace it because it's inefficient. And the private sector, who is the crony private sector that Dr. Isha talked about, is the one also who is supposed to drive growth in the region. So, yeah, it would be great if we could explore these sections, more. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's great to see so many hands raised, so much interest in the discussion. I think we've really provoked a good thought-provoking panel here. So there's a lot on the table, but maybe we can just start with our colleague in the back and his frustration with this idea that, the IMF and the IFIs, essentially before the Arab Spring, were praising government policy and feels as though we're kind of missing the boat. You have something you want to say on this, Timothy? Go ahead.
I was going to say, even after, what he's referring to actually took place in the interim, in the previous decade. Egypt got a lot of praise from a lot of IFIs. In the end of 2019, or mid-2019, they had successfully completed their IMF program, according to the IMF. The objectives laid out by the IMF in that program were as follows: a flexible exchange rate, private sector-led inclusive growth, an increase in labor force participation, especially for women and youth, and macroeconomic stability. Those were the kind of primary objectives, and Egypt got praise on that. In 2019, so before all the externalities, before COVID, before the invasion of Ukraine, what did we have? We had a rise in poverty. The private sector was in contraction. Labor force participation declined. From 2016 to 2019, female labor force participation declined astronomically. So it reached 16%. It is fifth from the bottom on Earth currently. It dropped from around 23% to 16%. And that's not completely independent of the decisions in the IMF. I'm not saying that the IMF is singularly responsible for that. But for example, when you want to reduce the public wage bill in a region where female labor force participation is heavily dependent on public sector employment, you should anticipate that will have a disproportionate impact on women who work in the workforce. And that's not because I'm a specialist on Egypt. It's because in my Introduction to Economics of the Middle East course back in 2007, I received a book written by the World Bank that said this, right? This is a basic thing. And I think one of my frustrations in this is that the literature is there. If you take the time to read it, if you have expertise in this region or these countries, you know this is going to happen. So either they decided that was okay and it was worth it, or they were unaware of it. But if you're aware of it, you should have mitigating policies, or you shouldn't put that as your objective while implementing policies that you know will exacerbate the problem. And I think the frustration is that while all this is happening, Egypt's getting praised. And it's not just rhetoric. The IMF talks about its catalytic impact, its ability to mobilize capital, to mobilize access to credit. So that praise gave an unsound sense of confidence in the markets that allowed Egypt to borrow enormous sums of money, that it was lighting on fire, building the tallest tower in Africa in the middle of the desert, the longest monorail in the world through the desert. Again, economically unsound decisions, while the population was deepening its poverty. And so you're watching them abuse this access to credit. You're helping catalyze it further. They're borrowing more. And the country is sinking deeper into unsustainable debt. And the reason that the deal with the IMF is $3 billion is not just because they saw no opportunity. It's also because Egypt's debt is increasingly unsustainable, and they're not allowed to lend if that debt's unsustainable.
So, Alexa, is there a sense in which the IFIs are complicit? Because I think that's sort of the underlying theme we're hearing from Timothy and our colleague in the back, that the IFIs are in some way complicit in supporting slow progress or no progress, supporting regimes where there's quite a bit of corruption, there's short-term political calculations, and a lack of reform. It's a pretty unflattering view of where the IFIs are, including the IMF. I just want to give you a chance as EBRD. How do you feel about that view?
I think maybe there is a conversation to be had here about mandates and whose mandate are the different topics. And I think the IMF's mandate, historically, has been to be the expert and the watchdog on macroeconomic stability. Let's not forget macroeconomic stability is important. It matters to private sector enterprises to know what environment they are entering, what macroeconomic fundamentals will prevail as they do their business. So there is a justification for monitoring that and looking out for principles. Let's also not forget austerity, much maligned, but the basic idea that you should not spend more than you're making in revenue is a good one. And holds for a lot of households and presumably also for a lot of people in this room. So the same extends elsewhere. That being said, I think mandates have to evolve, and I think it's a good thing that we're having a discussion about mandates that evolve. It would be even better if more institutions were represented up here in that discussion. I think to some extent that discussion is happening in Bab Irli. That is also a good thing. And I mean, yeah, do we want the IMF's mandate to evolve? I think it has already evolved towards putting a greater emphasis on structural reforms, a greater emphasis on social safety nets, a greater emphasis, they're developing expertise on climate change, on the macroeconomics of gender inclusion. The World Bank probably also has room to evolve in its mandate and the things it looks out for. But I think it's an ongoing discussion, and it is one that, again, like so many other things, ideally would move faster. But then aren't these, to some extent, our institutions as citizens? Don't we have, I mean, if we think about who is governing these institutions, it is our governments in the capitals. So maybe that's where we should also have a conversation, no? About changes in mandate.
I promise that's my job.
Can I add something?
Please, Isaac.
I mean, I think the quality of IMF programs in Egypt, to my taste, is very low. If you look at the documentation, you know, the 2016 program was predicated on investment rate of 15%, and Egypt was supposed to grow at 6%. I mean, it's very hard for this to work. There was an IEG report in 2018, or 19, sorry, that said, well, you know, we were lucky Egypt grew at 5%, like planned, or 4.5%, but it's by chance, because it discovered gas during this period, which was not expected during the program, but it did not grow because of the program. Now, if you look at the program today, the IMF projects investment rates to go up from wherever they are to 12% of GDP, and projects a growth rate of 5.5% of GDP. It's impossible. No country can grow at this rate without investing. So, yeah, there's something strange about these programs. They are truly driven politically. And clearly, the IMF doesn't believe its projection. Otherwise, it would have put a bit more money. It put only a little money because the debt is not sustainable. I mean, they project 5% for the DSA to look sustainable. And then they have a handshake for the Saudis to become the leading investor in the country. I mean, since when can a country grow without its own bourgeoisie investing?
We're basically out of time, but I want to try to very quickly hit on a couple of things. So one, do any of you have a point on Karen's question here about the monetary situation and the possible dollarization? What do you think is going to happen in terms of currencies in the region? Anybody want to jump in quickly on that, if there's a view? That's such a hard question.
Well, say something quickly, and then you take the hard part. Look, there are BOP pressures, and the currencies are under stress, and they will devalue. And as they devalue, the domestic debt, which is the main part of public debt, will become smaller and will give breathing space for these countries. And if they continue to go down the drain, external debt will become very problematic later. Now, they all obviously are resisting devaluation. They increase interest rate. They have quantitative restriction on import because it makes people feel much poorer. And the IMF is insisting that they devalue. So the pressure is there. You know, to some extent, they increase interest rate, you know, to prevent that. But you know, remittances are not flowing into Egypt right now, or if they do, they are going through the informal markets, or people are waiting for the valuation before buying into Egyptian assets. So it's a key area of tension. Will the government adjust and let the currency float or not?
Yeah, maybe I can move you to a different question quickly, unless you have some quickly you want to say about this.
No, Karen's too smart for me, and that's a very hard question that we can talk about it later, but I don't have a good answer for you right now.
Just as we wrap up, because you've been very critical of the IMF, it's great to hear that debate on this stage. I appreciate it. But I just want you to imagine that Kristalina Georgieva announces she's retiring tonight, and you're appointed as the new head of the IMF. I imagine the reforms you would seek would not be as simple as simply adding, more people with expertise around political economy. It seems like the IMF might itself find itself in a political game and feel restrained. We've heard from Alexa the idea that, look, IFIs, they have mandates and they have shareholders and they have their own restrictions. So what is it exactly you would want to see the IMF do differently?
Well, I don't wish that upon me, but look, I think it's a good intellectual exercise. I criticize the IMF, but don't worry, I criticize all the governments that we're talking about as well, plenty, to the extent that the Egyptian one may or may not welcome me back. And what we're doing here is exactly what you suggested. As collectively the publics that own these institutions, we're holding them to account. And I also do that privately with them quite frequently. I think that while diversifying expertise is one element of it, and I've heard I asked Kristalina about this actually in a town hall, and I've also asked executive directors about it, because they're all talking about the need for granularity. And in order to be able to absorb granular information, you need actually to know about the context in a variety of ways. So I do think that's useful. Is it enough? No, of course not. But I think my main objective would be to bridge the gap between the literature and the practice. I think that the IMF has concluded, at odds with your view actually, that austerity is counterproductive. It actually harms your ability to grow. And without growth, there is no way to achieve debt sustainability. You can't cut to debt sustainability. It's a fiction. And you're not going to find examples of it. So what you need to do is to have programs that think more about growth and think realistically about growth. You can't just say 12% is going to get me to 6% growth. It's not going to happen.
Some magic math in a spreadsheet doesn't just
No,
make it so.
there's a lot of magic, and I'm not a magician. So I would focus on what the data has already shown. The World Bank has shown in its literature we need to have universal social protection. I would completely abandon this austerity plan. And I realize that governments themselves, I mean, they obviously need to write the programs, but we also need to engage more with the publics. I think political sustainability of these reform programs is a really major issue, because what happens is you design programs that are front-loaded with a lot of pain, often with limited consultation with these publics. Admittedly, it's an autocratic context in a lot of the cases that we're talking about. But the result is, because you've accepted regressive, painful programs, the public will push back, the program gets derailed, they've taken on new debt without the sustainability of the reforms that were supposed to be in place, and you're just in a worse place than you were when you started.
Alexa, I want to give you the last word, and maybe we start where we began with the word austerity. I think you're right in some kind of technical sense, right? You can't spend what you don't have, but I guess it all depends on the time frame. And so the argument, as we just heard from Timothy, is, look, if you try to cut your way to growth, you won't get there. You've got to find other ways to invest, and that means austerity doesn't work, fundamentally. Since you brought it up, you made that point. How do you see this? Because we're here talking about this idea that we got to move from austerity to inclusive growth. Isn't it really a dichotomy, or you think these two things work together?
I think we have to make them work together. You cannot get to the kind of macroeconomic stability with taking on ever more debt. That will never lead to the kind of circumstances that makes foreign investors run to Egypt, Tunisia, and other countries in the region and in the world eagerly to invest if the government might go bust in the near future. That just doesn't work together. So I think we need some elements of debt sustainability and policies that look to that, but we also need a lot more policies that support growth, be a lot cleverer and a lot more targeted and strategic about the kind of investments, government expenditure that we encourage for social safety nets, also for sensible growth-enhancing kind of infrastructure, roads, schools, education. Those are the things that are really important. And I think we also need elements that think more about the political dimension that drives progress to reforms. I think ever the optimist, I think there is a lot of understanding of what should happen. Making it happen is the challenge, and that is where I see room for improvement also in my own domain of IFIs, where we can work better together and we can more explicitly acknowledge existing challenges.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, and please join me in thanking the entire panel for this conversation. It's really clear to me this is a debate that has to continue. I think it's also clear that people talk about an annual meeting of an IFI and they think, well, it's a lot of bureaucrats, it's a lot of technocrats, but ultimately, these are very rich, very hot wire political issues that affect real people's lives all over the world. And I think we began to get into that a little bit today, how important the musing of economists and white papers actually turn out to be on the ground. And so I think this conversation and the support of the Open Society Foundations on these issues is so critical to have at an annual meeting like this one in Marrakech. So I want to thank OSF. I want to thank all of the organizations that have been present here today. We have many from civil society and from many different organizations that really need to be part of the discussion here in Marrakech. And for all of you joining us from around the world online, thank you as well. We'll stay on this beat at Devex. Thanks for being here.
Some austerity and avoid